What happens when one of music's most beloved legends walks onto a daytime talk show expecting a friendly chat about his career, only to be blindsided by a host who decides to turn the conversation into a personal attack? In just 46 seconds, what started as a pleasant interview transformed into one of the most shocking confrontations in British television history. And it would take only one comment, one unbelievably disrespectful remark, to send Paul McCartney storming off the Loose Women set, leaving the panel in complete chaos. The studio audience had settled into their seats that morning with the kind of excited energy that comes with knowing they're about to see a true icon. Paul McCartney, the man who literally changed music forever, was scheduled to appear on Loose Women to discuss his latest projects and share some stories from his incredible journey. The panel consisted of Denise Welch, Linda Robson, Kay Adams, and Nadia Sawalha. And from the moment Paul walked onto that stage, you could feel the anticipation in the air. He greeted each panelist with genuine warmth, shaking hands and offering that famous smile that had charmed generations. The audience erupted in applause. This was supposed to be a celebration, a chance for fans to hear from someone they'd admired for decades. Paul sat down, looking relaxed in a casual blazer, ready to share his insights and memories. Denise Welch opened the conversation. "Paul, thank you so much for joining us today. We're absolutely thrilled to have you here." Paul nodded graciously. "It's lovely to be here. Thank you for having me." So, Denise continued, leaning forward with what seemed like genuine interest. "You've had such an extraordinary career. Tell us what you've been working on lately." Paul's eyes lit up as he began talking about his recent music projects, the creative process that still excited him after all these years, and how he was exploring new sounds while staying true to his roots. He spoke about the joy of making music, about collaborating with younger artists, and about how grateful he felt to still be doing what he loved. The other panelists were engaged, nodding along, clearly enjoying his stories. Linda Robson asked about his songwriting process, and Paul gave a thoughtful, detailed answer about how melodies often came to him at unexpected moments. Kay Adams asked about his memories of performing at iconic venues, and Paul shared a funny anecdote about a technical mishap during a concert that had actually made the show more memorable. Everything seemed to be going wonderfully. The conversation flowed naturally. Paul was charming and humble, exactly the kind of guest any talk show would dream of having. The audience was hanging on his every word. But then something shifted. Denise Welch, perhaps feeling like the interview was becoming too safe, too predictable, decided to take things in a different direction. And what came next would shock everyone watching. "Paul," Denise said, her tone suddenly changing to something sharper, something almost confrontational. "I have to ask you something that I think a lot of people wonder about." Paul looked at her with polite curiosity. "Of course, go ahead." "Your success," Denise continued, crossing her arms. "Some people might say you've been riding on the coattails of your Beatles fame for decades now. Do you ever feel like maybe you're taking up space that could go to newer, more relevant artists?" The studio went completely silent. You could have heard a pin drop. The other panelists exchanged uncomfortable glances. Linda Robson's smile faded. Nadia Sawalha looked genuinely shocked. The audience seemed frozen, unsure if they'd heard correctly. Paul's expression changed. The warmth in his eyes dimmed slightly, but he maintained his composure. "I'm sorry, could you repeat that?" Denise didn't back down. In fact, she doubled down. "I'm just saying, you had your moment. The Beatles were incredible. Nobody's denying that. But that was decades ago. Don't you think it's a bit, self-indulgent to keep touring and releasing music when there are so many young artists struggling to get noticed?" Kay Adams jumped in, clearly trying to redirect. "Denise, I don't think that's quite fair to say." But Denise waved her off. "No, I think it's a valid question. I mean, how many times can you play Hey Jude before people get tired of it?" Paul sat back in his chair, processing what he was hearing. His jaw tightened slightly, but his voice remained calm. "Well, I think the thousands of people who come to my concerts would disagree with you. They seem to enjoy hearing those songs." "But don't you think," Denise pressed on, her voice rising slightly, "that you're living in the past? That maybe it's time to step aside and let fresh voices be heard?" Nadia Sawalha couldn't stay quiet any longer. "Denise, what are you doing? This is Paul McCartney. Show some respect." Denise turned to Nadia with an irritated look. "I am showing respect. I'm asking honest questions. Or are we supposed to just fawn over every celebrity who walks through that door? Linda Robson shook her head. This isn't honest questioning. This is just rude. The tension was building by the second. Paul remained seated, but you could see the disbelief in his eyes. Here he was, a man who had given the world some of the most beautiful music ever created, being told he was irrelevant and self-indulgent by a talk show host on live television. Denise wasn't finished. And another thing, she said, pointing a finger at Paul. All these musicians from your generation, you all act like you invented music. Like nobody before you mattered and nobody after you could possibly measure up. It's quite arrogant, don't you think? Paul's composure was remarkable, but you could see the hurt in his face. I've never claimed to have invented music. I've always been incredibly respectful of the artists who came before me and those who've come after. I've spent my entire career collaborating with and supporting new talent. Oh, please, Denise scoffed. Actually scoffed at him. That's just good publicity. Everyone knows you older musicians are terrified of becoming irrelevant. Kay Adams stood up slightly in her seat. Denise, stop. This has gone too far. The audience was stirring now, murmurs of discontent rippling through the crowd. Some people were shaking their heads, others looked angry. This was not what anyone had signed up for. Paul looked directly at Denise, his voice steady but firm. I came here today to have a pleasant conversation about music and my career. I've been nothing but respectful to you and your colleagues. I don't understand why you've chosen to attack me. Denise leaned back with a smug expression. I'm not attacking you. I'm just not going to worship you like everyone else does. Someone needs to be honest. Honest? Paul repeated, his voice rising slightly for the first time. You're not being honest. You're being needlessly cruel for no reason that I can understand. Linda Robson reached across the table as if to calm things down. Paul, I'm so sorry about this. This isn't how we normally conduct interviews. But Denise cut her off again. Speak for yourself, Linda. I'm tired of pretending that every celebrity who shows up here deserves to be treated like royalty. Paul McCartney is just a man who happened to be in a successful band 60 years ago. That was the moment. That single sentence. The look on Paul's face shifted from hurt to resolute determination. He'd had enough. Nadia Sawalha gasped audibly. Just a man who happened to be in a successful band? Are you serious right now? Paul stood up slowly, carefully removing his microphone. The studio went dead silent again. Every eye was on him. His movements were deliberate, controlled. He wasn't storming off in a rage. He was making a choice, a dignified choice to remove himself from a situation that had become untenable. I think we're done here, Paul said quietly, his voice carrying through the silent studio. Denise looked almost pleased with herself. Oh, are we? Can't handle a little criticism? Paul looked at her with something close to pity. This isn't criticism. I've faced plenty of real criticism in my career, and I've learned from it. This is something else entirely. This is you trying to make yourself feel important by tearing down someone else. The audience erupted in applause, actual applause for Paul's response. Some people stood up. The support for him was overwhelming and immediate. Kay Adams looked mortified. Paul, please, don't leave like this. But Paul shook his head. I'm sorry, but I won't sit here and be insulted. I've been gracious. I've been patient. But I don't have to subject myself to this kind of treatment. Denise actually laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. This is unbelievable. The great Paul. McCartney can't handle a tough interview. Linda Robson stood up now, her voice shaking with emotion. This isn't a tough interview, Denise. This is you being absolutely horrible to a guest who's done nothing to deserve it. Paul began walking toward the exit. The cameras followed him. The audience was cheering for him now, showing their support, their disgust at how he'd been treated. You could see people calling out encouragement, telling him he didn't deserve this. Nadia Sawalha turned to Denise with genuine anger in her voice. I hope you're proud of yourself. We just humiliated a legend on live television. Denise crossed her arms defensively. I didn't humiliate anyone. He humiliated himself by being so sensitive. Sensitive? Kay Adams looked like she couldn't believe what she was hearing. You attacked him from the moment you started asking questions. You belittled his entire career. You called him irrelevant and self-indulgent. How did you expect him to react? Producers were scrambling now. You could see people rushing around in the background, unsure how to handle what was unfolding. This was live television going completely off the rails. Paul paused at the exit, turning back one last time. His voice carried across the studio. I've been doing this for a very long time. I've been interviewed thousands of times. I've been asked difficult questions, challenging questions, even uncomfortable questions, but I've never been treated with such open disrespect. I hope whatever you were trying to accomplish here was worth it." And with that, he walked off the set. The door closed behind him. The greatest songwriter in popular music history had just walked out of a talk show interview because the host had decided that insulting him was somehow good television. The remaining panelists sat in stunned silence. The audience was still buzzing, still processing what they'd just witnessed. Linda Robson had tears in her eyes. Nadia Sawalha looked furious. Kay Adams was shaking her head in disbelief. Denise, however, seemed almost triumphant. "Well," she said to the cameras, "I guess he couldn't handle a real conversation." "Are you joking right now?" Linda's voice cracked. "You just drove away one of the most important musicians in history because you decided to be cruel. There was no reason for any of that." Nadia leaned forward, speaking directly to the camera. "I want to apologize to Paul McCartney and to everyone watching. What just happened here was inexcusable. Our guest deserves so much better than this." Kay nodded in agreement. "Absolutely. Paul came here in good faith, ready to share his stories and his time with us. And instead, he was attacked. I'm mortified." But Denise refused to back down. "Oh, come on. You're all acting like I committed some terrible crime. I asked questions that needed to be asked." "No," Linda said firmly. "You ask questions designed to hurt and belittle. There's a difference between challenging someone and being plain nasty. And you were nasty." The studio audience was getting restless now. Someone shouted from the crowd, "You should apologize." Others joined in, a chorus of voices defending Paul and condemning what they'd just witnessed. Denise looked around at the hostile room, perhaps finally realizing that she'd miscalculated badly. But instead of showing any remorse, she doubled down once more. "If people can't handle honest dialogue, that's their problem, not mine." Nadia stood up, removing her own microphone. "I can't be part of this. I'm sorry, but I can't sit here and pretend this is okay." She walked off the set as well, leaving Denise, Linda, and Kay behind. The cameras didn't know where to focus. The show was falling apart in real time. Linda was wiping her eyes. Kay was trying to figure out how to salvage something, anything, from this disaster. And Denise sat there, arms still crossed, looking defiant even as everything crumbled around her. From backstage, you could hear raised voices. Production staff arguing about what to do next. Someone was probably trying to convince Paul to come back, to finish the interview, but that was never going to happen. He'd made his decision, and it was the right one. Back on the panel, Linda tried to address the camera. "I think we need to take a break. This has gotten completely out of hand." But before they could cut away, Denise had to get one more word in. "All I'm saying is that celebrities need to be held accountable. They need to be questioned. They can't just expect everyone to bow down to them." Kay turned to her sharply. Holding someone accountable and treating them with basic human decency are not mutually exclusive. You can ask tough questions without being disrespectful. You can challenge someone without insulting them. What you did today was cross every line of professional conduct. The audience applauded again, this time for Kay's words. It was clear where everyone's sympathies lay. Paul McCartney, a man who'd given the world countless gifts through his music, had been mistreated on live television, and the people watching weren't having it. Linda spoke up again, her voice stronger now. "Paul McCartney has influenced generations of musicians. He's written songs that have brought joy to billions of people. He's used his platform for good, for charity, for positive change, and he walked onto this stage today expecting a respectful conversation. Instead, he got ambushed." Denise rolled her eyes. "Oh, here we go. Everyone defending the rich, famous musician. This has nothing to do with him being rich or famous," Kay shot back. "This has everything to do with treating another human being with basic respect, something you clearly forgot how to do." The tension between the panelists was now as thick as the tension had been with Paul. The show was eating itself alive. What should have been a highlight, a ratings bonanza with one of the biggest names in music, had turned into an embarrassing spectacle of unprofessionalism. From somewhere in the studio, a producer's voice called out, "We need to go to commercial." But Denise wasn't ready to stop. "I stand by everything I said. If Paul McCartney can't handle being questioned, that says more about him than it does about me." Linda looked at her with something close to pity now. "You really don't get it, do you? This isn't about him not being able to handle questions. This is about you being unnecessarily hostile to someone who did nothing to deserve it. You weren't questioning him. You were attacking him. The cameras finally cut away, but the damage was done. In living rooms across the country, people were picking up their phones, taking to social media, calling their friends. What they just witnessed was already becoming the talk of the nation. In the studio, as soon as the cameras stopped rolling, chaos erupted. Voices were raised, accusations flew. The remaining panelists were furious with Denise, and she continued to defend herself, insisting she'd done nothing wrong. Meanwhile, somewhere in the building, Paul McCartney was likely being escorted out by his team, his day completely derailed by an encounter he never could have anticipated. He'd walked in as a guest, ready to promote his work and share his passion for music. He'd walked out as the victim of one of the most bizarre and unnecessary confrontations in talk show history. The audience was still there, still processing, still talking among themselves about what they'd witnessed. Many of them had come hoping to see their hero, to hear his stories, to maybe even get a chance to meet him. Instead, they'd watched him be driven away by someone who seemed more interested in creating controversy than conducting a meaningful interview. Back in the studio proper, the argument continued. Kay was speaking in hushed but intense tones to Denise. Linda had her head in her hands. Production staff were scrambling to figure out how to continue the show, or whether they even should. Someone suggested bringing out the next scheduled guest, trying to move on as if nothing had happened. But how could they? How could anyone pretend that the show hadn't just imploded in spectacular fashion? Nadia, who had walked off in solidarity with Paul, was reportedly in her dressing room, still upset about what had transpired. She'd worked hard to build a reputation as a fair and thoughtful interviewer, and watching a colleague treat a guest so poorly had been too much for her to bear. The makeup artists, the stage managers, the camera operators, everyone who worked on that show was talking about what had happened. Some were angry, some were embarrassed, some were worried about the fallout that was surely coming. And through it all, Denise maintained her position. She refused to see what everyone else saw so clearly. She insisted she'd been doing her job, asking hard questions, refusing to engage in celebrity worship. But everyone else knew the truth. This hadn't been journalism. This hadn't been a tough but fair interview. This had been a talk show host deciding, for reasons no one could quite understand, to tear down a guest who had done absolutely nothing to deserve it. The makeup artist who had worked with Paul earlier said he'd been lovely, kind, and appreciative. The stage manager who'd shown him to his seat said he'd been gracious and friendly. Every single person who'd interacted with Paul McCartney that day had nothing but positive things to say about him, which made what happened next so much harder to understand. When the show came back from commercial, the panel was down to 3. Nadia hadn't returned. The atmosphere was tense and awkward. Linda and Kay tried their best to continue with the scheduled programming, but their hearts clearly weren't in it. Denise sat there, still defiant, still refusing to acknowledge any wrongdoing. They attempted to interview the next guest, but even that person seemed uncomfortable, clearly aware of what had just happened. The energy in the studio was completely off. What should have been a fun, lighthearted talk show had become something else entirely, something uncomfortable and sad. The audience wasn't engaged anymore. They were still thinking about Paul, still upset about how he'd been treated. Some people had actually left during the commercial break, unable to stomach watching any more of the show after what they'd witnessed. As the program limped toward its conclusion, it was clear that this would be remembered as one of the most disastrous episodes in the show's history. Not because of technical difficulties or scheduling problems, but because a host had decided to treat a beloved icon with contempt, and it had backfired spectacularly. Linda and Kay tried to end things on a positive note, thanking the audience for being there, promising better shows to come, but their words rang hollow after what had happened. Denise said nothing, just sat there with that same defiant expression, unwilling or unable to recognize the magnitude of what she'd done. When the cameras finally stopped rolling for good, when the audience had filed out and the lights had dimmed, the full weight of the day's events began to sink in. The crew packed up their equipment in near silence. The producers gathered in worried huddles, already anticipating the storm that was about to hit. And somewhere far away from that studio, Paul McCartney was probably trying to make sense of what had just happened to him. A man who'd spent his life creating beauty, who'd brought so much joy to so many people, had been treated with shocking disrespect for no reason at all. He'd handled it with grace and dignity, removing himself from a toxic situation rather than escalating it further. He'd shown more class in his exit than his host had shown during the entire interview. The contrast couldn't have been clearer. On one side, a legendary artist who'd remained calm and composed even in the face of unwarranted hostility. On the other, a talk show host who'd let whatever personal agenda or need for attention she had override basic decency and professionalism. As the studio emptied out, as people headed home or to the pub to discuss what they'd seen, one thing was certain: this would be talked about for a long time. Not because Paul McCartney had lost his temper or behaved badly, he hadn't. Not because he'd said something controversial or offensive, he hadn't done that either. This would be remembered because it was a perfect example of what happens when someone mistakes rudeness for bravery. When someone confuses attacking a guest with asking tough questions. The loose women's studio, usually a place of laughter and light entertainment, had become the site of something much darker. A place where respect had been abandoned, where professionalism had been cast aside, where a host had decided that hurting someone was more important than honoring them. And Paul McCartney, the man who'd written Let It Be and Hey Jude, the man who'd soundtracked so many lives, had simply walked away. He'd refused to participate in